Thank you. So just as we get started here, I think the purpose of what we're going to try to accomplish right now is to have a conversation about how individuals like yourselves in the room could gain a better understanding of what the boards and what the senior level management of your organizations are facing and what they're seeing and what are some of the things that they're thinking about. Because it's a good opportunity, or maybe as good as any opportunity now, to create that closer bond between yourselves and the boards, because there's money to be spent and there's a fair amount of headline risk that's out there. So I think we're going to shift to the next slide, and we're going to give an introduction to each one of our panelists real quick. Right here to your right is Martin McKeay. He's Akamai Technologies security evangelist, who he also is moving to London. So if anybody lives in San Francisco and has anything that you might be interested in getting from him that he's leaving behind, you might want to see him later.
It's too late.
Next to Martin is David, which I'm sure most of you know, CEO of CodenomiCON. Some of the things that aren't in his bio real quick, to show you some of his background in the financial services space, is I think he started as a currency trader.
Correct.
And then he built and sold trading systems, correct, including online trading systems. So his familiarity with and interest in financial services dates quite a way back. Our third panelist, Scott Kaine. I've got a nice little write-up on Scott. He's the president of Cyveillance, or Cyveillance,
There you go,
which is one of the leading threat intelligence firms focusing on the financial, energy, and technology industries, telecommunications. Prior to joining Cyveillance, he held several management positions with Booz Allen, which is, in case you don't know, that's where Snowden came from. So we're going to hold that against him. VeriSign, MCI, and he was in the U.S. Army as an intelligence officer. So our panelists today have a lot of good perspective to share with you, and I think as we get underway real quick, just to give you a little background on the financial services sector, there's this public-private partnership that's going on where, particularly in financial services where it's heavily regulated, the public sector is the government, the regulatory agencies, and they're really making a concerted outreach towards the private sector to partner up with them. And there's a couple of different areas. I'm not going to read these here, but it's the FSSCC. It's the private sector, and they're working on strategy. And their agenda, as you can see up here, really kind of represents a lot of things that I'm sure that you're all familiar with. These are the focus points where they know their shortcomings. The next one is really the sharing organization, which is this ISAC, which is really trying to force the private sector to work with the public sector to be able to start sharing information with each other. Because I think previously, and I'm sure the panelists will have some comments on that, the information wasn't shared in any great way. Last one is really the regulators themselves are really trying to act in the control tower fashion with this FBI-IC to make sure that all this is happening in a coordinated way, and that's just government officials. We do have a panelist here, Scott. I don't know if you guys had heard about this Quantum Dawn 2 exercise that SIFMA had sponsored, but I think Scott participated in the first one, or at least was part of Quantum Dawn 1, so maybe I'm just going to turn it over to him real quick, and he can share some quick thoughts on what this is.
So it was an exercise conducted a few weeks ago, had a lot of press, and fundamentally what it was trying to take a look at the financial sector and figure out how they would respond to an attack. So specifically what they would do is they would go through certain protocols, and the objective was to see if various factions within the financial community could work together and share information to stop, resist, and get through a particular threat. So the report card was very positive. Couple of notes out in the press. I think since it was primarily a business process and procedural and information sharing exercise and not a technical exercise, it got a few dings because they didn't really actually simulate hardcore attacks to see how network devices, as an example, would react. But what they did was, in my opinion, tackle the hardest thing, which is trying to figure out what's the game plan once we have a problem, who do we call, and what type of information is important enough to share, and make sure that you're sharing it with the right people to make yourself resilient. So, anytime you're able to get various factions together, there's some government entities, there's big banks, mid-tier banks together, and go through this. It's like a fire drill. If it happens the first time and you haven't done a fire drill, you've got people spazzing all over the place trying to figure out which end is up, and I think a lot of us have been in that situation when a crisis occurs. So this was an exercise to demonstrate by planning how can you effectively share information to kind of get through a big attack to the financial sector. So various reports as to whether or not they'll do another one. It's supported by SIFMA, a big organization of financial management side of the house, based out of New York City, and just a well-done exercise. A lot of very positive reviews, but like I said, the only ding was there wasn't a whole lot of technical due diligence done here. It was more around the human factors piece, which is always tough when you're trying to figure out who you're going to communicate with.
Thanks, Scott. So just as we kick off, I just want to open this up with the two thoughts for the audience. Back to the theme from before, which is really, okay, headline risk is increasing, and really the opportunity to reach out to the boards to get money, to get things done in the ways they need to be probably are as good as ever. And I'm going to give you two quick examples. The OCC, which is a regulatory body for financial institutions, comes out with a semi-annual risk assessment. The one that they just came out with in June, middle of June, mentioned in the opening summary, these are comprehensive reports that they put out. In the opening summary, they mentioned the word cyber 7 times. The one that they did 6 months before, they mentioned it once. So you've got an exponential increase in organizations, and in this case the OCC, really putting a focus and throwing it out there for people to say, hey, here's our chance to understand it, those of us that aren't deep and familiar with it. And I think that's the opportunity that we're presenting. Another thing is from the head of global cybersecurity at Chase, at JP, Anthony Belfiore. Here's a quote. 2013 has been the noisiest year ever. We're seeing exponential growth in terms of volumes and number of attacks. This is not trending down. Again, opportunity to really kind of go out and get the money, the tools that you need by being able to communicate with the boards to get them to understand, at least to a degree in which they can support your cause in a bigger and better way. Let's open up with some questions for the panel. And I'd like to start with something around, can you share some relevant cyber terminology or lexicon that board members might be interested in having to be familiar with? And you follow that with a brief definition. I think the purpose here is really to put it in layman terms, because obviously many of us in the room have a thorough understanding and definition of some terms that we're very familiar with. So let's put it out to the panel and see what terms, what terminology they may find that boards would be interested in learning more about.
I guess I'll start.
Yeah,
I think for the financial services sector right now, one of the big terms is DDoS. Distributed denial of service attack. We have seen so many DDoS against the banks in the last year that we know what's going to happen. We have just started another round of the QCF attacks. We don't know what they're doing. They are a very intelligent, adaptive enemy. And DDoS is actually, for the financial services, one of the things you have to be concerned about, and one of the things they should understand what it is. It's also important to understand because usually it's just a smokescreen. There's other stuff going on behind the scenes, and they need to know that too.
Yeah, I talk to a number of boards, and often the problem is that the knowledge level varies substantially. So really you have to educate, draw on the board, explain what a DDoS attack is, and really ask questions to see if they really understand it. Because it's quick to say, oh, a DDoS is this, and then everybody nods and you move on, but in reality, they haven't understood. So I find it's really a sales process. You have to educate, then you have to ask questions and see if they really understood. And now it's a great time to reach out to the boards because so much stuff is happening in the headlines. They're probably more interested to spend some time.
Well, I think, David...
Yeah.
David, one of the things there that I think you mentioned that we can accentuate again is that we may understand the definition of these terms in our language or our lexicon, and the question is, and you don't want to say that you're dumbing it down, but you're trying to make it simpler for the others to understand that aren't as deep in the knowledge.
And it's not important what the term means. It's important what is the impact on my business.
Yeah, so I think a classic case, which is really easy to do in the boardroom, is, as we know, mobile devices are a lot of fun. The biggest offenders of using these mobile devices in an incorrect way are the board members. Most likely the board presentation was sent to them via someone's Yahoo account, and they're all showing up there and using that to take a look as you go through the pages. So, the key issue is that as the perimeter expands, and we all are probably ad nauseum have talked about what to do about mobile devices, the truth is there are a lot of firms that really don't have a handle on it. So from a board perspective, as you talk about, hey, listen, how did you get this information sent to you today? You could even play around a little bit and send it to their personal email if you want to. They'll recognize that. They love their iPads or whatever device they happen to be using. It'll click with them that was probably not the most secure way for them to have this information. And then it should naturally dawn on them that, hey, look, how are we doing this as an organization? Because if I like to do this, but I recognize that this is a big risk. What are we doing within our company? So the whole mobile device management piece, where you're trying to integrate security and access control into mobile devices, resonates, in most of the conversations that I have, because they will freely acknowledge that they're probably one of the worst offenders doing things that they shouldn't be doing with their devices, and therefore it's a lot easier for them to, basically lay down budget or support an initiative that's going to look enterprise-wide to really take a look at tackling that problem.
Okay, so now that we've gotten some of that, some of the base terms knocked out, let's put to the panel what kind of noticeable changes or actions or requests from the boards should we be expecting or are we seeing related to the fact that, remember, board members are like any of us. If there's headline risk, and there's more headline risk in terms of what they're reading about in the press today, what are some of the things that we should be expecting to get from the boards as it relates to things that are now top of mind for them?
I've got a somewhat sad but comical story. From a board perspective, what I'm finding is a couple of things. Number one, they're more enlightened in terms of the problems that are out there. You can't swing a dead cat without finding some article around who's been hacked. If it's in their industry, they obviously want to know more about it. So giving them situational awareness, if you're able to give them a snapshot of what's happening in the industry, they always seem to want to know what's happening to their peers, business peers, and fundamentally in their industry. But a big trend that I'm seeing is they're starting to worry about themselves. Because as a lot of these folks are going out there, it's not a matter of trying to get the data or the money. A lot of organizations are doing that. They're also going after embarrassment in the brand, and the way they're doing it is by tackling the executives, but even in a more scary fashion, the executive families. So the wives and the kids who have their social media profiles out there. A lot of these activist groups are having a field day by going after at a personal level, executive members of the board or anyone with a VP title within the organization. And we're getting a lot of questions about, hey, what are we doing to protect us? Pretty straightforward reaction, but there seems to be, in addition to recognizing within the industry itself that it's becoming way more prevalent and destructful, they're also noticing that the individuals are also looking at going after them. So this whole notion of executive protection is being talked about in a lot of discussions that I have, which is, hey, how can you ensure that we as a board are protected from these groups that might be coming after us or our families personally? So it's a new twist that I've seen in the last 6 months as things have moved from embarrassing the business to embarrassing the people that are running the business. And there needs to be a game plan to give them the right security blanket. If nothing else, what they ask for a lot of times is just an assessment. Can you sniff around? Can you tell us if there's things out there that might be problematic so we can fix that? And if there's no problems, then great, I feel a little bit more secure. But the whole personal aspect of folks going after board members themselves have been a new trend that I've noticed in the last 6 to 9 months.
Another thing to remember is that they're talking amongst themselves. That's something I'm seeing a lot more of, hearing a lot more of, is that they know what's happening to other businesses. The board knows what's happening out there. You're not operating in a vacuum. They're actually saying, what have other banks done? What have other financial services done? And rather than reading the news about it, they're actually going and calling their friends on the other boards and finding out, and then coming back to security teams and mandating what they want. So it's very important that we know that those conversations are going on, and that we know what some of those conversations actually had in them, so we can talk to our compatriots at those other banks. We can find out what they're doing and make sure that we either know what's coming down the pipeline from the board, or know what the board's been told, so we can help build upon that to get the projects and products we want.
And I just want to add to that, it's key that I've seen, you have to have good situational awareness on what's happening in the industry, because the board members or executives within a particular firm will hear through various sources, as was just mentioned, that such and such occurred. And if you're just looking at your own organization all the time and not really getting a feel for what's happening outside, now granted, a lot of organizations who get hit aren't running around with the press saying, hey, guess what, we just had a major problem. But people talk. So it would behoove, I think, most of you to have a good understanding of what's happening, because you're going to get the questions on how did this happen to Bank A, or what happened to Bank B, and your inability to explain that type of situation isn't going to make your executives feel as if you've got a handle on things if you're not potentially watching what's happening outside your property.
And I think the key point here is you can actually reach out and talk to your boards when things happen in your industry to explain to them what can be done, what happened, and this type of thing. So when these conversations happen, they're spun up better than they are today. So again, if you're proactive, is make your life a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on to another topic of saying, okay, now that the boards have increased headline risk, they have increased understanding, they're sharing with each other across boards, what are the things that they're facing and the organizations in which they're in see. Let's answer the question for the board from the audience's perspective. If a board member came up to them and said, hey, how should I assess the level of the cybersecurity within this organization? What are some of the things that they should be looking at that would be important to them because they're important to us?
Oof. That one gets kind of hard, because it requires us to understand the business. It requires us to understand the business processes rather than the technology. I mean, it doesn't matter how good we are at configuring a firewall, monitoring an IPS, monitoring an IDS. How well do we understand how the changes we want to make are going to affect our business? Do we understand that when we put in a new filter, some of the salespeople may not get their email from a client because suddenly that client is filtered for some reason? Do we know how our work is going to affect the business as a whole? And that's what we have to be able to communicate to the directors every time we talk to them. And unluckily, still in this day, I think there's still too many of us who don't quite understand that and need to work on it more.
Yeah, I would say there's various ways to skin in this thing, but there's three primary ways the board or anyone on executive panels will do something. Reasons they do something. First is there's a compelling regulation out there. They have to do it, right? You don't want to get fined. So regulatory issues. Then you have a crisis. You basically don't have a choice. You've got to react to a particular thing, so folks are going to rally. The third reason they'll make a decision on a security piece is based on a business case, which just so happens to be the hardest thing to try to get anyone at a budgetary level to approve on, because you're talking about, in most cases, trying to quantify the value of a boogeyman. And that makes life hard. So I think the challenge is, and I've done this with various clients on the professional service side, is try to create an ROI where you're taking a look at the business, and ultimately through a lot of work, what you're able to articulate is, for every dollar I spend on training, or every dollar I spend on firewall software, or every extra IDS that I plop out there on the network, I'm reducing $50 million worth of risk. So if you help me spend $5 million, that will help reduce, let's say, $100 million worth of risk based on probability of people losing laptops or probability of hacks happening because you don't have enough whatever out there. But that's the holy grail in the security industry. Spent oodles of months trying to get there. I think we did a pretty fair job of it, but it really just resulted in the ultimate business case, which is it converted risk into ROI. So it was a notion of, hey, look, if we don't spend this money, here's how much money you're potentially putting this company at risk at. And you can have a compelling discussion. If they don't agree with assumptions, you can play with those. But 9 times out of 10, the classic ounce of prevention will result in good things, but sometimes it's challenging because you're not able to put it in a number, and that's what a lot of folks at the higher levels are looking for. Hey, what am I going to get out of this? So that ought to be, I think, a very aspirational thing for most security organizations to do that. I don't know, do you want to take questions? Or?
I think one of the key things that we really have to help the boards understand is that a lot of the problems out there are because of poorly written software. And again, they vote every day by the stuff they buy. So again, if you buy crappy software, crappy boxes, crappy appliances, you're going to have problems. So again, companies can actually proactively buy from quality vendors that make better software, more secure software, and really educating them on how they spend their money, and really buying stuff that is more secure is going to make their lives a lot easier and save them a lot of money.
So let's address a tough question that a board may ask, and it goes into the organization from the perspective of, and there is some trends out there that says businesses should run this, and that the IT, cybersecurity, InfoSec folks should be vendors for the businesses, because the businesses are the ones making the decisions, the businesses are the ones that are taking the risks. How do you address that if a board came to you and said, hey, look, I think we should give this to the business, and the business should try to direct the information security folks to work on their behalf? Where does that break down?
My perspective would be, you can do that. There's organizations that, a lot of the government organizations are structured that way, where you'll have a chief security officer, and fundamentally what their role is governance. They create the rules that everyone has to live with, and then essentially each of the security units are deployed back down into the business lines. And that can work. The other way is you just have a separate pocket of a security organization that kind of rides herd over everyone. But I think the common theme is, no matter how you're organizationally structured, whether you put pockets of security professionals within the business, or you have just a separate organization that's riding herd over everybody from the outside, if you're not engaging the security teams early in initiatives, and they're only there at the end to kind of make sure that before the box gets pushed out onto the conveyor belt that it's secure, you're going to fail more often than not. So I would say that organizationally, I think you can probably debate one way or the other, but at a minimum, the common theme is, wherever they are, if they're not involved with an initiative, let's say you're launching some new site or new app or whatever, new financial system, if you're bringing in the security wonks at the end, similar to they do traditionally with QA, you're going to have problems. They ought to be there right at the beginning, be engaged, and I know a lot of challenges exist with that, but if you do that, it's embedded throughout the process and you get a much better product at the end, despite how the organization's set up.
But that's not the responsibility of the business. It's our responsibility as the security team to be reaching out, to be looking to get involved early. And that's not easy, because all too often we're in an adversarial role as opposed to be a complementary role. So that's one of the big things I think we have to learn as security professionals at all levels, is that we have to reach out in a way that is supportive of the business process and enables that, rather than being invited in at the last minute. We need to make sure that we're reaching out and working with those groups. It doesn't matter what the organization is. What matters is how we interact with the rest of the company, and making sure that they realize and we realize we're not a separate entity. We are part of the company, and we need to make it work.
I totally agree. You got to start early. You have to reach out, and planning and designing is the best way.
So Martin, to what you just responded, it's a wonderful idea to get out there in front of the business and to work with the business. What's the most optimal way to do that, though, within an organization? Because, there's these centralized organizations, there's these decentralized organizations. Let's look for the Holy Grail, because we know it's coming, and it's going to come in one way, shape, or form. Let's talk about how we can be successful in managing that to happen in an effective way.
The best way to do it is be a startup and be the one who's building the security program from the beginning, but not too many of us actually get that opportunity. All too often we're coming into something with personalities involved that has existed for years, and it's a hard boat to turn. It's a psychology that we have to look at in ourselves and figure out how do we get more involved in the business. Unless you are building the sort of society into your company that makes security an integral part from the beginning, it's something that's going to take you time, that's going to you have to understand is going to take a change to the way the business does business, and that takes a while. So there is no optimal way or optimal path on that.
Oh, I would say that, trying to get the cultural shift to do what was articulated there it takes time, and if you pull it off, life is good. But tactically, something to consider is that most organizations have a budget cycle. For us, in my company, our fiscal year starts in April, goes from April to April. Well, we start hacking on the pencils in November, December timeframe. We start to create the budget for the next year. That's the time you get engaged, right? So if you know when the party's going to be, trying to get invited to the party during that timeframe, I think, is crucial, because if you can embed yourself during that 3, 4, 5, 6 month process in some cases, while they're developing the budget for the next year, you've basically implanted yourself for consideration down the line, instead of worrying about, hey, the website was just deployed, secured, and you're saying, well, I didn't have budget for it because I didn't know it was coming down the pike. So, something to consider. There's budgetary cycles in most companies. Figure out when that is, and then that's the time you kind of push yourself on folks to invite you to the party. And I think that would be reap good dividends for you.
Business people, they think about money. So basically, if you can help them understand the advantages of building it right the first time, then it's a lot easier for them to adopt it. So really, sell the benefits.
Do you see any benefit to the idea of embedding a point of contact within the information security world to be assigned to a business? Because remember, when you talk to the business people, every one of their businesses is complex, and it's ever changing and it's ever evolving, both from a marketing perspective and from the resulting financial perspective. Some businesses will come to you and say, you know what, Joe may be smart, but the proverbial Joe may be smart, but he doesn't really know my business, so therefore I'm not sure how he can really add value to me other than in a very generic way that may slow down the process. Do you see any value to actually embedding individuals within the business from the information security side of the world to actually walk arm in arm with the business throughout their life cycles beyond just the budgets?
I think it really depends on the organization. Some organizations that works great, others they need a more central top-down approach. Again, I don't think one size fits all there.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to it being, how is security baked into your business? If it's baked in that somebody should be calling security to add a security layer to the product or to the project, that's great. If you don't have that sort of identifying factor that we have to have security involved, it doesn't matter if you have somebody in the team or a totally separate team. They're not going to communicate either way.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a top-down management decision.
Mm-hmm.
Management really has to say security is important, we need to do something, and then organize however it works.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we've just about run out of time. I just want to run one other question by, which seems to be coming, at least from the headline side, kind of sexy, is the social media impact within organizations, which basically employees' actions and the way they deal with social media can have an impact in terms of how and if the organization can be penetrated. Does anybody want to share any thoughts on that? Is that an evolving situation? Is it something we think we have under control from the information securities?
Yeah, I'll start. We spend a lot of time on this with our clients. Social media, as my analysts will tell you, it's just delicious. There's so much good stuff out there. If you're trying to get into a company and trying to launch, let's say, a spear phishing attack, one of the first places you're going to is social media to dig up what you can to make it much more personal when you're coming in the door. So, I would encourage, so what do you do about it? Well, number one, there's definitely a concern if you've got employees that are putting information out there that can then be used to try to get into an organization. Not good. So what can you do about it? Well, I would encourage most companies to have some type of situational awareness program. You can outsource it, you can bring it in-house, but it's not difficult to figure out what keywords you care about and just marry them up, employee name and company name. And if something pops up, then you basically figure out, okay, is this something that's problematic? But I would encourage most companies to take a look at it because what we're noticing with a lot of our clients, especially for the teams that are going after executives, they're using social media as a source of the data to then turn against and go in because it's amazing what type of personal information folks are just willing to share out there. And most mature organizations have a social media policy.
They do?
But, yeah. So at least they'll tell you that. But if you don't, obviously you should do that. But in addition to that, I would encourage most folks to just take somewhat of a look out there in the open source world to kind of make sure that on a weekly, daily, monthly basis, they're policing up the social media activities that might put their brand and specifically their employees at risk. But yeah, it's delicious fodder, like I said, for folks who want to get in. Social media provides a lot of good nuggets to get in.
I think it's all about education also. You have to educate the employees what can be used against them and how it can be used and what they need to be careful with. And again, password protection, a lot of this really basic InfoSec stuff. It's just you got to tell people all the time.
And I would disagree with them. I think most companies have looked at social media and said, we'll worry about it later, or they've thrown something in. If you have a chance, go look up IBM's social media policy. It's one of the best ones out there. It basically, in a lot of words, says, act like an adult. That's it. But companies really do need to have that social media policy so they can help define what is an adult. You've got to understand what's going on, and don't let HR run roughshod and decide they're going to write the social media policy. Step back. Have other people involved. Have other organizations involved. But also be aware that there are severe dangers with social media. There are severe risks with social media that are not going to go away, that are only going to get worse, especially as more geolocation data comes in. If you want to scare your CEOs, go do some digging on their social media. It will turn up some very interesting things, and some of them you probably might not want to know about your CEOs.
So does training? I mean, great. So there's a way that we have to pass this on to the group as a whole. Is training the answer to that?
Yeah, I think training is very helpful. It helps pull out real world situations. I had a meeting last week with my company, and there was a question around LinkedIn on whether or not our analysts can connect to our customers, right? Very real situations. So how do we want to deal with this? Is there a potential of us? If our customer is connected to us via LinkedIn, does it expose our customer to a problem if someone's trying to go after us? So what we ended up having to do was we scheduled yet another training event. The training events are great because what will happen is you're going to get lots of questions from the real world around, hey, well, how do we handle this situation? How do we handle that situation? And most social media guidelines, I think, are generic at best, if a company even does have one. And by having the training, the folks out in the field are going to come back to you with good questions about real situations that you're like, I haven't thought of that before on how to interact on Facebook. Yeah, no, you can't say that. I'm glad you brought that up because we didn't think of it that way, but that's a good point. So I think that's vital, not so much that you want to, it's a one-way, it's all the feedback you're going to get because people are going to have a million questions about, well, I understand what you're saying, but how would I do that? And then you're going to go through an understanding of what you need to be modifying in your policy to address real-world issues.
And as someone who has been fired from a job because of social media, be careful what you say out there.
I gotta look that one up.
Well, I think we're out of time. Thanks very much. If anybody wants to follow up with Martin on what that was, I'm sure you might be able to pry it out of him, but I can't promise. Thanks so much for your attention. And the panelists for their time.